death.
Yeah, that's it. It is very on brand for me. It's about death. And I think we talked about maybe doing confessions or something.
There were a few options in the air.
Yeah, I thought that's not intense enough. I need something even more depressing. Also, I've only read 3 books in my life. This is one of them. So, and it's a short one.
It's a short one. Makes it easier. It's short, but it's...
Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles, who are 2 commentators, political, cultural, whatever you want to call it, have a video where they're talking about The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is a novella by Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And it's about this guy called Ivan Ilyich. He's a Russian, and he's, I think, a sort of middle-class, yuppie kind of guy. That's how Matt and Knowles describe him, as a yuppie. And so, he has this apartment where he has all the agreeable yuppie furniture that all the middle-class people think the rich people have. But in actuality, only the middle-class people have, because they're the ones who think that the rich people have it, even though the rich people don't. Anyway, so he's living this very sort of ordinary middle-class life until one day he falls from a ladder and then dies. But in between falling from a ladder and dying, there's a several, I think, months-long stretch where he's slowly suffering from this injury that he has. And it's not an instant death at all. And worst of all, it's not even like a heroic or a tragic death. It's just someone coming to the fact that he will die, which of course he would have anyway. It's just now he has to face it starkly, bedridden, completely crippled by a trivial nothing. Something that's been really funny to me over the past couple of months, and I think I mentioned this before on my channel as well, probably when I was doing the Jordan Peterson readings, is during COVID, a lot of people have been saying, if you take the vaccine, or if you take this treatment, or if you do this, or if you put on the mask, your chance of dying will go down significantly. It's like, really? I'm pretty sure your chance of dying is still 100%. Maybe your chance of dying from COVID, or your chance of dying in the next few months will go down a fair amount, but I don't think your chance of dying will go down from 100% anytime soon. And that, I think, is a broader cultural symptom of people who have refused to acknowledge that they will even grow old, let alone they will pass on into immortality, whether that's in heaven or hell. Haha, what do you think of segueing into over heaven? I say that, but I'm not actually going to segue to over heaven just yet. Yes, that they will die. They have forgotten that they will die. And so culturally you see, 60-year-olds dressing provocatively, quote unquote, wearing sexy clothes, quote unquote. Of course, they forget the fact that clothes cannot be sexy in and of themselves. It's the bodies that are sexy. And no 60-year-old ever, do not deceive yourself, can ever be sexy. All right? Let's lay that as a foundational principle of human existence. So, yes, there is a strange insistence that death is something that is bargainable, let's say. It's something that you can bargain against. I've had this image in my mind for a while now of, imagine like a long, well-lit road. Think like a midday. It's noon on like a well-kept forest road, and you can see for miles and miles and miles and miles away, you can see the single solitary figure of the grim specter of death standing there with his scythe. Maybe the little metal curvy bit at the top is even sparkling in your eye. But still, you avert your eyes and you say, no, that's not happening, while you walk along the road. No, that's not happening. And then you look up and, oh shit, he's closer. How did that happen? And finally, at the end of your life, you look up and, oh my God, he's right there in front of you. Holy goodness, when did that happen? What are you doing? Oh my God. And they get jump scared by death. How is that possible? It's this outrageous idea that somehow death is an accident in and of itself. You can die from accidents, but death itself is not an accident. And simply turning away from it and looking up at the last moment and going, is an insufficient excuse to say, well, I'm not ready, Why am I talking about this? Well, time to actually segue into Over Heaven, but no segue has ever consisted of the words, let us segue into our topic. Let's talk about Dio. Dio, at the end of Over Heaven, has reached this sense of profound mortality from, of course, the fact that all of his friends and all of his servants and all of his supporters have been slowly picked off one by one, and the few people that he knows will outlive him, he has purposefully had to send away and ensure that he lives. He gives... specifically talking about Pucci, he gives him an actual bodyguard. Like, he tries to protect Pucci as much as possible, which in the end works out for Pucci. But as far as Dio is concerned, death has come to him. The grim specter of death comes in the form of a 16-year-old Japanese punk with a stupid hat. All right, that's what death means to Dio. But more importantly, it comes in the form of a birthmark on that Japanese boy's body in the shape of a star. It comes in the form of the Joestar bloodline. Because you go back in time, and Overheaven has been very good at paralleling, not only through ideas, but also literally in the text. All of these three stories from part 1, part 1, part 3, and part 6 are all continuing in tandem. So that when you get to the point where Dio finishes his diary and is about to go and die, he's just been reflecting on the fact that he already ought to have died a while back. And by a while back, I mean a century ago. In a way, that's his rebirth moment, right? You could say he was born again to steal from the Christians, as we've stolen with, heaven and holy mothers and all that kind of ideas. You could say that he was born again once by his mother, like his actual birth, and another time by Irina, who chose not to kill him. And in that sense, I think it's very interesting that Dio constantly brings up this idea of running water, because in a sense, that's exactly what a baptism is, right? To be born again through this ritual that involves immersing yourself in water. And being told, hey, you have to live this holy moral life, which is exactly what Irina's monologue, it's a little short for a monologue, but it's a monologue all the same. Irina's monologue at the end says. And that's really interesting because, in a way, that's exactly the story that is told to every Christian. And I don't know if Nishio Isen is a Christian. I've talked before how Araki is, or was. I'm not sure about his faith, at the moment. But, he derived a lot of Christian ideas. Obviously, Christ himself appears in part 7. He derives a lot of Christian ideas throughout JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So it's interesting for us to make it explicit, even if it's maybe not completely defensible. But there's this idea for Dio that he is tasked by his mother when he is born, with this incredibly difficult duty that he must perform of doing good, while being in this environment that completely punishes good. And he fails like any human will, right? Like there's no chance. Even if he was raised in a good environment, the chances that he will fail is very possible. And you might say, well, yeah, but Jonathan had a good environment, and he was raised perfectly fine. But that's why in part 7, those characters are resurrected as in a more human form, right? Jonathan, now Johnny, despite being raised in a wealthy environment, or a well-to-do environment at the very least, he still falls for temptation, right? He's still lustful, and he's still envious, and he's still wrathful. And it cripples him, literally, but it cripples him spiritually. That's the important thing. Until ultimately it is resuscitated by literally a confrontation with Christ, but more figuratively, the Christ figure, the Christ story in Gyro. Yes, but that's we're rushing into part 7, but really we should be focusing on part 1, where yes, he fails to do good because of his environment, but also because he acknowledges himself. Maybe he was born bad. Maybe this is exactly the way he ought to be. But Irina gives him a second chance, because Irina acknowledges all of his evil, even after he's crossed the threshold of failing to be human, right? He's become a vampire, and yet Irina says, listen, you've killed my husband, you have his body, I don't care, you still have this chance to become good. And that's I think the task that really befuddles him at the very end, where he says, it's quite something what Irina Joestar said, it's quite something what my mother said, to attain heaven despite the fact that I am evil, means I have to wrestle with my very nature all the time just to accomplish something that other people get basically for free. This is Dio speaking, obviously, my biological father might have gone to heaven because of this small gesture of pity that he had for me. My adoptive father probably went to heaven because of the love he had for his son. Jonathan obviously definitely went to heaven. And in fact, he seems to rue that fact that it is so easy for someone like Jonathan Joestar. At the very end, he seems to combine the two figures of Irina and his mother. He starts writing in his journal, full of anguish, how could you embrace someone like him when you never embraced me? And he's not talking about Irina there. He's talking to his mother, but he's not even talking to his mother. He's talking to the holy figure that inhabits both of them, which of course, viewing outside of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and from this Christian metaphorical perspective that we've taken on, I guess, would be somebody like the Virgin Mary, right? We're looking at this embodiment of mercy and grace acting upon people in order to encourage this behavior in order to redeem people, no matter how evil they are, right? No matter even if they are bad, or if they were born bad, the way Dio says he is, nonetheless, you can be redeemed. And this is something that I wanted to talk about when Andul's backstory was mentioned. I forget if I mentioned in that specific when I should have mentioned it. But Andul has this backstory where he is a poor, I think, orphan, but essentially he's isolated because of the stand power that he has, and he doesn't know who to trust, and ultimately turns him towards evil. And we think, oh, that's a very sympathetic backstory, but we forget, or I did anyway, we forget that Kakyoin has exactly the same backstory. Isolated because he has a stand, he doesn't know who he can trust, he doesn't know where to look, but he finds goodness all the same, and he finds it in another Christ figure of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or in another Virgin Mary figure of Holly Kujo, who instills in him that impulse towards mercy and grace. There is this Christian idea as well that the Holy Spirit is the thing that brings you towards Christ, and Christ is the person who brings you towards God. I don't really know what that means because I'm not I'm not like a full-blown Christian. And while you can compare this Holy Spirit idea to the idea of a stand, I'm not going to do that. What I want to say is that this idea of the Holy Spirit can also, it seems to be awoken in people in the JoJo universe anyway, or in the Over Heaven universe at least, by interacting through these Holy Mother figures. So that Polnareff has the same journey as well, where he sees this holy figure whom he loves in Cherie. So yes, that's the journey that Dio ought to have taken throughout his life. But despite his many interactions with the holy figures of his life, he seems to reject it every single time, no matter what. Why is a different question, I think. And the one that's really hard to answer. And I don't think Over Heaven quite answers why he rejects goodness all the time anyway. I mean, it does, but not in a way that is completely consistent. Dio constantly questions himself and keeps asking, oh, but do I believe that? And why do I feel this attraction towards them? Why must I destroy them? I think in the end, he's ruining the fact that it's difficult in the first place. He wants it to be easy almost. And certainly it's been very easy for him to, as a vampire, to establish his evil, right? And it's been very easy for him to manipulate people around him since he was very young, since even before he was a vampire, to get people to be on his side and against the people that he dislikes. And I think, that's one of the reasons why as well he gets so angry when Irina rejects him, rebels against him, and wipes her mouth with muddy water. It's because suddenly he has an obstacle and he's never had that before. Or rather, the only obstacles he's had are the ones that have been more evil than him. So that for him, it's been a competition, an arms race almost, to see who can be the worst. So that when he's confronted with someone who is virtuous, it's like, I don't know how do you wrestle against this? He doesn't know that you don't actually counter virtuousness. You embrace it, right? You become part of it. You inhabit and embody mercy and grace, which are difficult things even for normal humans to do, let alone a vampire. As to the question of why mercy and grace are important, even in the world of Over Heaven, I think you have to look at Dio's mother, who, like Dio specifically says, she might have lived in heaven on earth, even if she lived in a hellish place. See, because here's the thing about heaven, so to speak, is that you can't really live in an earthly heaven, right? That's the Christian doctrine of the fall. Everything is calamitous and ruinous no matter what. But you can live in a heaven within yourself. You can only create a heaven for yourself. And that is granted to you through the practice of mercy and grace, and no other way, really. That's, I think, what it means to have the Holy Spirit living in you. And like I said, I still don't know what that means, but yeah, I'm pretty sure these words have meaning, and I think that's exactly what the meaning is. The opposite of that is that you inhabit hell, but unlike heaven, which doesn't spread outwards, right? It's something that you contain within yourself, and you only hope that everyone else shares that heaven with you in your isolation until obviously you die, and then you do sort of escape time and the limitations of earthly existence so that you do share this heaven with everyone else as well. Hell is something that escapes you, right? And finds itself finding purchase on earthly existence as well. Even if you alone choose to inhabit it, it doesn't really work like that. Your negative actions, no matter what, propagate, start corrupting, working their way through the rest of the material world until as much of hell as can be manifested physically, seems to be present. And, maybe that doesn't mean you're living in a fiery inferno, but maybe it does. Maybe you do happen to find yourself through your bad choices and nothing else burning your adopted parents' mansion down. I don't know, let's say, just an example. I'm looking at my notes here and I see that I've skipped a little point that I wanted to mention, which is that I forget where I read this because I certainly haven't read Nietzsche himself, so it must have been a secondhand source. But apparently Nietzsche has this critique. There you go. Nietzsche has this critique of Christianity, which is that because Christ is a figure of mercy and grace, because the whole story, the Christian story, is one of mercy and grace, you actually lose a moral impetus to do good, right? Rather than acting good, it's an excuse to act evil and then beg forgiveness. Well, like what's it say? Better to say sorry than it is to ask for permission, right? Nietzsche's point is that that's not a good enough moral system, and ultimately it leads to the corruption of our moral sense. And what that means is that Christ becomes a permission for evildoers to reach heaven, which sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Instead of what he says he is, a way, a path into heaven, right? An exemplar of the moral choices required in order to attain heaven. And, I probably got quite a significant portion of that wrong. Like I said, I haven't actually read Nietzsche. And as far as I spelt this critique out, it's not, I can't source anything. This is just my sort of memory of a secondhand source. So take it with more than a grain of salt. But in a way, it's very correct. You see that same impulse driving Dio. I don't have to be good. I can find heaven through a secondary source. But, you can't really play that game because in not acting good, you enact you enact a hell upon earth. And so you ultimately have to find this weird paradox where by creating hell on earth, you attain heaven. And so we bring ourselves back to Andul, where Dio says, I would like to bring someone like Andul to heaven. Someone who has suffered, someone who knows what it means to be alone and rejected by people. I would like to grant him heaven. But recall what I said about Kakyoin. It's someone like Kakyoin who gets to heaven because it's not about Andul's circumstances. It's about Andul's choices. Ultimately, Andul decided to, murder people, and Kakyoin decided to pursue a path of justice. It's very cool that Kakyoin is associated with justice, by the way, because he's blinded. He has to wear those glasses. So he becomes symbolically a figure of justice. That might be a bit of a reach. I appreciate that for some of you. You're going, what the hell is this guy talking about? But I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas. I mean, the book is called Over Heaven, and it's about a guy trying to get to heaven. So, I mean, ultimately, we have to wrestle with these spiritual ideas one way or the other. But going back to Nietzsche's idea, I think the reason he's wrong is because, I mean, it's not like we wouldn't be evil if God was a little bit harsher with us. We'd still be just as corrupt and bereft of the moral will, right? Like, by which I mean, we would still be tempted towards evil. We wouldn't immediately be able to say, oh, that's wrong, therefore I will not do it. No, we'd say, oh, it's wrong, but oh man, I really want to do it. I think I will do it. I think I will do it. And that's what I mean by the lack of a moral will. But nonetheless, we recognize that it's there, and we recognize the value of mercy and grace, and we see people who act in this way, and we think, gosh, that's a heroic person. And I would like to be like that. And you see it in nearly all of our stories as well, that all of the people whom we would like to call heroes act like Christ. They follow the path of Christ. And by which I mean they don't follow Christ, but, you know, Christ says he is the way, whatever that means. Like, imagine if someone said, I know you asked for directions to the McDonald's. I'm not going to tell you the way. I am the way. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? But we have to take him at his word, and we have to say, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, we look at fiction and we see that Spider-Man, oh, what's he doing? He looks like he's standing in a cross position, sacrificing his life in order to save the people of New York. What's Neo doing? Oh, he looks like he's in a cross position, sacrificing his life so that he can save the world. What's Harry Potter doing? Oh, he sacrificed his life in order to save the people of Hogwarts. What's Aslan doing? Oh, Aslan's kind of cheating because he is specifically and explicitly written to be a Christ figure. But does it really matter if it's explicit or implicit, if the intent is the same? I don't think so. As for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, obviously Christ is literally in part 7, as I've said. And Gyro is specifically a Christ figure, as I've said. Not to mention all the others that please. She's getting literally crushed by a cross. Do I even need to... Come on. As it relates to Over Heaven, I think specifically, it's not so clear-cut who the Christ figure is, but rather it's the Stardust Crusaders as a whole. Obviously, Abdul dies and comes back to life. I don't know if you know this, but that's one of Christ's most popular tricks. Iggy obviously willingly laid down and sacrificed his life for the sake of Polnareff's defeat of evil. But more than that, I think the really important one, I've already talked about Kakyoin as the image of justice, which is interesting because right at the start, it's Kakyoin, while mind-controlled, who says justice doesn't exist, really. What exists is power. What exists is the strength between you and I, and whoever wins is the so-called justice. And Jotaro says, if that's the case, then I'm gonna win because I'm right, and I have goodness on my side. In that sense, Jotaro completely subverts this, postmodernist idea, if we want to be Peterson-esque about it, that there is subjective truth or a subjective morality that can be bent simply by who's in charge, right? Oh, that slavery was moral back then because everyone did it, but now it's immoral because no one does it. You can't say that. You have to say slavery was wrong back then, which is why we stopped it, and now nobody does it because we enforced the truth and the moral nature of the world as it ought to always have been, right? That's Jotaro's sentiment. That's the sentiment of true justice. And in that sense, it's the justice of God. It's something that transcends what you and I can decide for ourselves. It's something that enforces itself on us. And so in that sense, Jotaro is the Christ figure who comes at the end of time with the sword coming out of his mouth to pass judgment on people. So yes, that's a very Christ-like figure. I'm going to show you a clip of something that Andrew Clavin said about God that I think is really, really funny. So, roll clip.
One of the few good sides of this pandemic we've been in, that, God, the still reigning and undefeated king of the universe,
Applause for God, guys.
Yeah, God.
Give it up for God.
Yes, God, the still reigning and undefeated king of the universe. The reason that's so funny is because there is no thing that can wrestle against God, right? Like, yes, God is the king of the universe. If he just said that, it wouldn't have been funny. But there's this idea, the bit in between where he says the still reigning and undefeated implies that someone has tried to challenge God, and that's a laughable idea in and of itself because there is no way to win. You're fighting against the ability to fight itself. It's a self-defeating system, right? You can't win. You cannot win. There's no such thing as winning in this fight because there's no such thing as a fight because the only reason the fight exists is because the thing you're fighting against is the thing that created the fight in the first place. Oh my God. So this statement, the still reigning and undefeated king of the universe, is true on a surface level, but there's a significant paradox that it sits on top of. And that's the idea that truth and justice can be fought against on any level whatsoever. And that's the reason why, if we accept this idea that Jotaro is the embodiment of that ultimate justice, which he is, he is written as much and he says as much. When Jotaro, spoilers for part 6, by the way. Although, if you've listened to this entire audiobook, then I don't know how much else I could really spoil you on. But when Jotaro dies at the end of part 6, you know that there's something wrong with Pucci's heaven, right? There can be no true heaven where justice is gone, is defeated, is no more, is vanquished, is immaterial, and is in nothing anymore. You don't think the same thing for someone like Weather Report or Anna Sui or even Jolene, right? When they die, it's, that's what the story is. But when Jotaro dies, it sort of transcends the story and you go, what the hell's going on? Did the personification of objective truth and morality just die? That's not possible. Something's wrong here. Something is very, very wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because Pucci has been saying all this time, this is heaven, we're trying to attain heaven. But you can't have heaven without God in it. So that when that happens, immediately there's this uncanny feeling of this is not going to work out. In this vein, I wanted to bring up something that C.S. Lewis writes in The Abolition of Man, which is a pretty difficult text, by which I mean I barely understood it. And really I should be rereading before I talk about it. But it's a very... He writes about this strange but very profound logical puzzle, essentially, where man has been trying to conquer nature, right? And our most effective tool against that is science. But Lewis writes, it's not really science. You know, people have this strange idea of science that it's almost like magic, that if you do the right things and if you learn the right spells, as it were, the right incantations, deoxyribonucleic acid, right, whatever, then you can do whatever you want. Men can turn into women, and fetuses aren't babies anymore. You know, you can do whatever you want. You're the ultimate arbiter of the world. But even then, you aren't really the ultimate arbiter of the world. Only the people who created that technology are. They govern how you use that technology. So really, it's not man's conquest over nature. It's man's conquest over man through science. And in such a way that every single conquest over nature allows for the growth of man's own sort of animalistic tendencies. You know, a new pill allows you to lose weight, so now you can indulge in gluttony. Contraception allows you to indulge in lust, right? The more you conquer nature, the less you have to rely on this divine, spiritual aspect of yourself, the will, right, the mind, and the more you can rely on simply your animalistic nature. And Lewis points out at the extremities of that, if you extend that to its furthest logical conclusion, then when man completely conquers nature, then he has reverted completely into an animal. So that ultimately he returns to nature. And here's the logical conundrum. The moment man conquers nature, nature, in fact, conquers man. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's the same idea, both thematically as well as from this idea that we can control everything in the world. We are the ultimate arbiters of truth and justice. When Pucci kills Jotaro, this embodiment of objective truth and justice and morality, it's not that Pucci suddenly inherits that. Instead, no one has it. And so this heaven that ought to have been a bliss of people recognizing evil before it happens and being content with it, instead they just fail to recognize what evil is in the first place because they have no objective sense of truth or morality anymore. That's what I think anyway. We strayed quite a bit from Dio, but honestly, I like where this conversation is going, so let's keep going. Pucci's heaven, let's talk about it, because it's the same as Dio's heaven anyway, so we can kind of tie it all together at the end, hopefully. Pucci's heaven spawns with this idea that if only suffering could be preconceived or cognized, then it would fail to be as evil. You would have a certain acceptance of it that would allow you to continue through it and have resolve through it. But what I really see happening is that all you really end up doing is failing to recognize the nature of evil. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, there's this middle part where the sort of cynical atheist Ivan is talking to his priest brother, trying to convince him of atheism. And he says, look, there was a child in rural Russia who was locked away in an outhouse and forced to eat her own feces by her parents because, just for no reason. And it was the freezing cold of winter, and she beat, and he has this very emphatic turn of phrase where he says she was beating her chest, crying all night for them to save her. But she died of the cold before morning ever came. Tell me, where was God there? And that's the most perfect summary of the problem of evil. Now, my answer to Pucci's heaven comes from that story, which is, how the hell does failing to recognize that is evil, being resolved with the fact of this young girl's murder, and therefore it's not suffering anymore, how the hell is that a sufficient response to the problem of evil? Once again, quoting from C.S. Lewis, this time from a different book, The Problem of Pain. He says the following: if evil is present, pain at recognition of the evil, being a kind of knowledge, is relatively good. For the alternative is that the soul should be ignorant of the evil, or ignorant that the evil is contrary to its nature. Either of which, says Thomas Aquinas, is manifestly bad. And I think, though we tremble, we agree. And ultimately, throughout these past analyses, I've been talking about the problem of evil, maybe not as much as I should have, maybe a little bit too much considering it's more of a Pucci thing than it is a Dio thing. But ultimately, the resolution is very, very simple, which is you can't resolve the problem of evil in this way, right? Because the failure to recognize something as evil doesn't mean it's not evil. Being soul deadened to the death of a young girl, or even to death in general, or even to suffering in general, doesn't mean that the suffering isn't extant all the same. Doesn't mean that it isn't a tragedy all the same. So Pucci's heaven is flawed in that way. You could make a stronger argument for the problem of evil. I'm not saying that Pucci's resolution for the problem of evil is wrong. Therefore, there is no problem of evil. Therefore, God is good and all that. And I highly recommend reading C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain if you want to get the sort of theological arguments for why a good God could allow an evil world, an evil in people. But as far as over heaven is concerned, as far as Dio's idea of heaven and Pucci's idea of heaven is concerned, it doesn't really resolve this central idea at the problem of evil, which is its existence, not its acknowledgement by us. And the fact that Pucci and Dio even think of it this way recalls what I said earlier, where there is no objective truth or objective morality. There is, in fact, no thing beyond what we perceive of the world. And so it's all about us. It's not even a narcissism. It's more of a solipsism. And I've talked before about how the devil is this sense of self-indulgence to the point of rejecting all that is good, to the point of solipsism and self-worship, to say that, oh no, there's nothing besides what I feel and what I think. And obviously that's not true, but it is a very tempting idea all the same, and people have fallen prey to it many times throughout the past, to the point that it's been personified in human culture as Satan, as the devil, as Lucifer. The really hilarious thing to me about this, though, is that ultimately it fails even for Dio. As he says himself, I knew, I know. He's already known that everything that he needed to know, right? That to have so-called resolve against the future. That Irina was the one who saved him. That she wished for him to be good and gracious and merciful, and ultimately to attain heaven. But no matter how much he knew, he lived in denial this whole time. And he was willing to fight against that fate of his to become a real human being. Real human being. A godly, a good person. Until the very, very, very end, when his mortality caught up to him, when the Stardust Crusaders catch up to him, and with them, like I said before, collectively they are the presence of Christ. When at last Christ comes to him to deliver that ultimate justice that is God's. Only then did he realize, okay, maybe this idea of seeing into the future isn't actually sufficient heaven. Maybe I do need a better heaven, but it's too late now. All I can really do is totally commit in entry 80. The only thing that was necessary was location. I've calculated it. Do with it what you will. I'm going to go to die. And I think he knew that. Mainly because he'd accepted that he lost to Dio, or to Jonathan and Irina so long ago. He wasn't now, I think, cocky enough to be like, oh yeah, but now that there's 4 of them and they have these superpowers called stands, now definitely I will survive. I think he knew very, very well that he would not be surviving the night. Yes, maybe there was a sense of precognition that he wanted from heaven so much when he actually went to that tallest tower to end the fight against the Joestar bloodline. There's one other thing that I want to talk about with Pucci and Dio's idea of heaven, which is that heaven, in the Christian sense, has this, theologically, is understood as being outside of time. Same with God, right? They exist outside of time so that God is right now, but God is also tomorrow. We will be tomorrow, but God is tomorrow. And we were yesterday, but God is yesterday. Does that make sense? I'm not saying that God is the day yesterday. I'm saying that God is still in that time period and he's still looking at it. And God is looking at a time period that we have no understanding of, tomorrow, the future. He's already there, but he's also right here, right now, and looking at us. There's a lot of reasons why that's been put forward by Christian theologists since like 200 AD or something. It's an old idea, and it's a very, very strong idea. There's a similarity with Pucci and Dio's heaven in that they also flout the idea of time, right? All of time itself seems to be wound up in this moment that Pucci decided to create this heaven and sped it up and sped it up and sped it up until it was nothing more than a blur. But the difference there is that while God transcends time, right? That God's heaven transcends time, but Pucci's heaven, Dio's heaven, completely involves man in time so that they become basically the same thing. They don't escape time, they just become united with time almost incestuously, which is a term that I use not very lightly. I was reading Measure for Measure recently, and it used the word incestuously in that same sort of metaphorical way. In fact, I'll read it to you because it's a reason to read Shakespeare, and there's no reason not to. Basically, the context is there's a girl, Isabella, who's trying to save her brother from execution. So she goes to the prosecutioner, the Duke, the interim Duke of Vienna, and she says, "Hey, can you free my brother?" And he says, "Only if you sleep with me." And she goes, "What the fuck? No, get the fuck out of here." And then she goes to tell her brother about it. And her brother is like, "What the hell? That's ridiculous. He ought to be castrated. Oh man, that's a real evil person. Could you look into it though? Could you maybe try?" And Isabella responds like so. "Oh, you beast! O faithless coward! O dishonest wretch! Wilt thou be made a man out of my vice? Is not a kind of incest to take life from thine own sister's shame?" So there you go. In that same metaphorical sense, I say that it is a kind of incest between two creations of God, time and man, to be interwoven and interconnected to such a degree far beyond the capacity of just a man, right? Like we ought to be. It is the natural order that we go 60 seconds a minute. We have no right to go any farther than that, and it's an abomination to do that. Even though they're both involved with escaping time, one escapes in the sense of transcending it. It is no longer necessary. But another escapes it the way that a criminal would escape justice, right? Like it's a wrong thing to do. It's an improper, immoral act. This intermingling of man and time for the purposes of man. So that's just a cool little parallel that I wanted to talk about. To wrap it up, I guess, we still have quite a bit to talk about because this was ultimately sort of a broad review of all the ideas that were in Over Heaven, a book review, if you will. It's weird how these analyses, at the start, I felt so uncomfortable talking about heaven and all this. But because of that uncomfortableness, I did a lot of research, essentially a lot of, I wouldn't say research actually, just a lot of listening and a lot of reading to Christian perspectives and to what heaven means to different people. I say different people, but ultimately it was a very Catholic perspective that I ultimately thought was most appropriate to what was being discussed here. And in many ways, if you go back and listen to Analysis A, I'm pretty sure you can listen to me grow up in a lot of different ways, become more mature, become more interested about a variety of things. Not to show off, I'm just saying that it's weird how you can be motivated to grow up from something as simple as essentially fan fiction from a manga that I like. Maybe the real Over Heaven was the self-epiphanies we made along the way. Okay, well, I was going to do sort of like a generic book review, a book analysis overall, and then like a generic chapter analysis overall. But honestly, I mean, this was sort of the climax. These past few chapters have been the climax of all the stories and all the ideas, to the point that they ended up being sort of one and the same. Like I said, there have been 3 stories being told in tandem. The first was the part 1 story, with the climax of Irina being the one to save Dio. The part 3 climax is, of course, the end of the diary and Dio going to die. And the part 6 story is finally at the very end. It's the reveal of the location, right? The launch pad in Florida. So I don't really have anything to say about the chapter specifically. There was one thing that I thought was interesting, a short little quibble. And for this, I'll need to pull out my actual copy of part 1, the manga, where in the novel, Dio says, "Oh, as soon as Jonathan entered the hold, I immediately shot my space ripper stinger eyes at him." But when you look at the manga, there's like 2 whole pages between when Jonathan walks in and when Dio shoots his space ripper stingy eyes. And I'll read them to you now, just so you can see how absurd it is for Dio to say, "I shot him immediately. It was an ambush." All right, so Jonathan walks in. "Master Dio," this is Wang Chen. "Master Dio, I have lured him here as you requested." "My body, has it arrived?" says Dio. "Dio," says Jonathan. "Jojo, look at me, Dio, in this pitiful state. I chose to see you like this. Dio, says Jonathan. Again, that's apparently the only thing he can say. Why would I choose to see you in such a state, you ask? It's because I now respect you after all you've been through. Your courage, your spirit, your power. I respect all of those things. And I realized something. Jojo, if it wasn't for you, I never would have received the power of the stone mask. But at the same time, it is you who has kept me from taking the world for my own. If there is a God that controls our fate, then there certainly is no relationship better calculated than ours. We are one in the same in this world of ours. Thus, I must take the body of the only person in this world I respect, make it my own, and live out eternity with it. That is my destiny. I shall cause you no pain. That is my final gesture to you, my rival. Ha! Says Jonathan. Those eyes of his. Oh, this isn't good. Return to Dio. Live as one with me as my body. Jojo! And finally, he shoots the Space Ripper Stingy Eyes. And at the same time, Irina appears. Jonathan! And then Jonathan says, Irina! While getting shot in the throat. So, yes, that's very immediate. The classic, oh no, they have to get up the stairs in 10 seconds, and then it takes them 30 episodes to do so. From Hunter x Hunter. But other than that, if I've missed anything, then let me know as topics on whole on the book. As far as the whole book, reviewing the book, going back and remembering the book, if you want me to score the book out of 10 book, I would give it a 6 out of 10 book. I don't mean it in a bad way at all. I think it's worth experiencing. I just don't inflate my grades, as it were. The reason I don't give it more than that is because it's not a story that really needed to be told, and not in this format specifically. I don't think Dio's Diary had more of a mystery when it was just rhinoceros beetle, spiral staircase, the location it says is in the launch pad on Florida. These are words from my mother's lullaby. It's like, what the hell is going on in Dio's Diary? I think that element of part 6 sort of gets diminished a little bit when you think of that diary as being the same thing as we read here. Just that element of mystery was more special than what we were given here. And more than that, when I say it's not a story that needed to be told, I say that because by and large the story has already been told, right? A lot of what is written in Over Heaven was already written from Dio's perspective in parts 1 and 3 and 6, his meetings with Pucci, right? Do you believe in gravity? Stuff like that. And his discussions with Enya. These were all things that we already understood of his character, and Jojo is a very talkative text, especially the early parts, where, as I showed when I was reading the actual manga chapters there, Dio spells out completely how he feels. He doesn't leave it secret at all. It's not implicit, it's all explicated to the 10th degree. So it's very unnecessary for this story to be told. And it doesn't feel like a waste of time, but it does feel like a very redundant text. As a positive, I would say that there are certain loose ends that Nisio Isin tried his best to tie up and leave resolved. Especially like how did Dio survive the explosion, what happened with the coffin scenario there. But unfortunately, nearly all of that is speculative anyway, because I think Nisio Isin himself realized that the mystery is the charm of some of those things, and the strange paradoxes just make JoJo's Bizarre Adventure even more bizarre. But ultimately, the reason why I do give it a 6 out of 10, it's not all negatives. Ultimately, I think there is a depth to it that digs into all this discussion about the Holy Mother, about what it means to attain heaven and his relationship with his father and mother specifically. There's a nice little core there that maybe could have been expanded more if it was a more standard narrative form. And that stuff, especially the parts that dig into the faith and the heaven and the God and the justice and the whatever, everything I've been talking about so far, that stuff can extend infinitely, right? Like the book really could have gone on forever if he chose to focus on that. And certainly this analysis could really go on for a very long time if I really had a very thorough understanding of all of these different facets of what it means to be in heaven and to be outside of time and to be and to wrestle with the problem of evil and all that. If I had any sort of deeper philosophical grounding and had a higher IQ than like 75 or whatever, then maybe we could have just gone through this text forever, because it does have this depth there that it touches upon. And the other thing is, faith is sort of, people think of it as a superficial thing that sits on top of how you perceive the world, that like at the bottom is our rational, functional understanding of the world, and then on top of that is how we feel, and then on top of that is this tiny sliver of belief that, like God exists or whatever. But as far as I can tell, it's actually the opposite. Really, you have faith as the undergirding structure of everything. Like everything. And I don't mean faith in God necessarily, but all the things that you do have faith in could very much be tied to God, like objective morality and truth and justice and beauty and goodness. You have to have faith in those things. And if you bundle them all together, then you do get something like the classic monotheistic God. And without the faith in those things, it doesn't really matter what you perceive, or even worse, how you feel, right? Your feelings are trivial in the face of that faith. I'm not saying that, facts don't care about your feelings. I'm saying that faith in those things is more important at any given time than how you feel, which is why you can feel afraid, but you can still act courageously, right? Because the virtue of courage is derived from a deeper belief than simply, I want to do this. It's, I should do this. And where that should comes from is ultimately a matter of faith. Yeah, I do want to say one thing, which I thought was very funny, and I really wanted to share with you guys. After all this reading of Dio's diary, I was like, man, it'd be really cool to read Kira's diary and how it is to live this sort of invisible, empty life where the only thing that thrills you is murder because everything else is so blank and empty and superficial and vapid to you. And the life of this sort of nothing businessman, and a world that ultimately has very little to offer someone who is extraordinary, besides the things that it can only offer to ordinary people, must be a very crippling thing, so that the only thing he can turn to is murder, and gross and vile and cruel murder, and self-indulgence and vicious, violent murder. What must that feel like? What is the psychological state of someone like that? And how does he act around people? And how does he behave? It'd be very cool to write the diary of a person like that. And then I realized, oh wait, that's American Psycho. They wrote that already. So I thought that was very funny. That, on the one hand, Dio's diary is this strange whirlpool of gravity and heaven and all these other ideas. And then on the other hand, it's just American Psycho. Morio Psycho.
My need to engage in homicidal behavior on a massive scale cannot be corrected, but I have no other way to fulfill my needs.
Anyway, we're pretty much at the end. I do have a quick note about the afterword, which I'll publish in a separate video very, very soon. And the reason for that is just because when I make the full audiobook version, I can just sort of slap it onto the end and it'll be very convenient for me. It's very unlike the foreword. The foreword, if you remember, is a Speedwagon Foundation researcher, in fact, the very same who decoded Dio's diary from the glyphs, I think is the word he uses, the glyphs that it was initially written in, and then translating it into a human language. So it's very much within the universe. It's the diegetic text. But the afterword, on the other hand, is Nisio Isin being very honest and very charming, honestly, about his first encounter with JoJo when he was rather young, reading through Weekly Shonen Jump. It's weird how your first encounter with something you love always sort of sticks out very heavily. The example that I always turn to personally is not JoJo, because I don't really have a very good first encounter story with JoJo. I just saw an ad on Crunchyroll and I was like, hey, that looks really cool. Really cheesy because it's called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but also because of that cheese, very cool. But for me, I remember seeing an image. I used to play Lord of the Rings online when I was much younger. And on their forums, I saw an image of a map from Guild Wars 2 that was like, you can go to defend this castle, and if you win, then you have to go and support this village down here, and you can support the building of the fortifications, or you can push the offensive. But if you lose, then you have to retreat to this position, and you have to escort villagers from that village that otherwise you could have been helping if you'd won, and you have to escort them back to a more safe position against these centaurs that you're fighting this war against. And I was like, oh my god, this is intense. What the hell is this? And then I remember watching like this first trailer for Guild Wars 2 called the MMO Manifesto. Mind-blowing. I was like, oh my god, this is everything I've ever wanted from an MMO. So I remember just falling in love with that. And I remember the first video I ever watched of Guild Wars 2 as well was these two British guys doing a jumping puzzle in a map called Metrica Province, which I appreciate none of you are interested in this, but for the two people who have played Guild Wars 2, maybe you recognize that map. So if you know, IYKYK. Yes, I am a zoomer, you see. If you go to my, the one Guild Wars 2 video I have that's like 80 minutes long, I think the second shot in that is a shot from the very end of that Metrica Province jumping puzzle, where there's this like giant temple floating in the sky. And the reason I did that is because it's where I first sort of came to learn about this game and fall in love with the idea of this game. Relevantly also, the first shot in that video is on this narrow bridge crossing a gap in these giant like sea-swept cliffs. And it's barely lit by the sun hiding behind immense thunderclouds as the water rushes below you and whips up these massive waves all around you. And that was where I first met my girlfriend. Obviously, I'd met her before I knew her, but that was where I first went, hey there, you, hi, what are you, hi, where do you, hey, what, now, what the hell are you? You're one of them people. You're gonna change the rest of my life forever, aren't you? You're one of those people. And to tie it all together, I guess that's what gravity is, isn't it? It's this force that tells you immediately, this is someone profound to you. This is someone who's special to you, one way or the other. I think that gravity is really what Nisio Isin identifies when he's talking about Jojo here. Sort of this strange, maybe things that you didn't even understand at first suddenly have this profound impact on you. The way I would say Over Heaven, reading this novel, has affected all these things that I've, had to learn or else chosen to learn about heaven and all these other ideas. And hopefully I've communicated some of that to you guys, not only today, but in the previous analyses, if you've listened to all of those. I will say, if you have followed this journey from beginning to end, I'm really, really grateful. Honestly, it means so much that you guys have followed this for like 2 goddamn years. I've been awful with the scheduling. And especially this video, man, I really struggled with this video because I realized, how at the end Dio is like, I need location. Yeah, for me it was, I need emotion. For all these past chapters, I've been sitting there being like, entry 43. Today, I decided that Joestars are evil. Yeah, but like now at the very end, when he comes to this conclusion that he has been wrong about so much and he's had to wrestle with Irina's choice of having to save him, I couldn't just continue that. It just felt so unnatural, and I had to really wrestle with that. And the reason, in fact, for the delay of this last episode particularly is because I didn't know how to perform it. No matter how I tried, it ended up being too dead, right? Too lackluster. Ultimately, I started reading Shakespeare and also listening and watching to adaptations just to pass time, because that's what I do, I guess. And ultimately I realized, hey, yeah, what I need is emotion. I needed to be more ham about this. It's Dio, for God's sakes. He isn't just a slug sitting there, casually writing about his memories. He's full of passion and he's aggravated all the time. And I don't regret that the previous chapters are a bit flat, let's say, are unaffected, because he's trying to say, whatever, this is all beneath me. But now that it's come to this, now that he is confronted with his own mortality in the face of the Joestars, obviously it's going to come right to his heart. The other thing is I was very, very afraid. I was listening to this audiobook of Bishop Fulton Sheen, who, if you don't know him, you should really look him up on YouTube. He has these amazing speeches, and he speaks with this immense theatrical style, not in the sense that it's over dramatic or overwrought, but in the sense of like Hamlet, right? When he says, to be or not to be, that is the question. It's theatrical in the sense that it is the most artistic and beautified way of expressing this idea of what is life worth, and am I a coward because I choose to die, or am I a coward because I choose to live, right? There's no better expression of that in the English language, and that's what theater is for, right? And just the same way, Bishop Sheen does an amazing job of articulating a lot of Christian ideas about what it means to live like Christ, and why Judas's betrayal was so vulgar, I guess, was so reprehensible. All these rich ideas contained in the Bible, he sort of unpacks it. And he speaks beautifully. I think you should go look him up. But I am going to try and emulate his audiobook reader, because as an audiobook reader, this is the one kind of thing that I was really afraid of. And especially when I went back to listen to the Over Heaven audiobooks, I was like, oh my God, I'm not reading this flatly, am I? Because the audiobook reader, I swear to you guys, reads every sentence just this way. It was then that Judas decided to take up 30 pieces of silver to betray his Lord, Jesus Christ. It's like, oh my God, are you a robot? Please give me some emotion. Give me something to feel. Give me something of the drama that is part of this immense story of the Son of God. Like, what the hell are you doing, man? If Bishop Sheen had to say the same sentence, he would say this: that was how Judas decided to betray his greatest friend for nothing more than 30 pieces of silver. What value has it now? Nothing. And even then, even as he took the purse, he knew it held no value to him. Right? It's just so passionate and so beautiful. And so I realized that at the very end of the story, I needed Dio to be emotional. And it took a very long time for me to learn that lesson. But as soon as I learned it, bam, I was like, I know how to finish this now. I have to record it. And here I am. There was once a time when I wanted to do an entry a day so that I would have been done in 80 days. And instead it took 80 weeks. More than that, actually. Maybe double that. But yes, we're pretty much at the end. One final thing that I want to say about the afterword is I made these 3 Josephs. for the afterword. I didn't know which one to pick, but I have picked one, so don't worry about it. I completely forgot that he was in part 3, so that when I made the illustration of Jotaro and Iggy earlier in the year, I was like, yeah, now I have all the Stardust Crusaders in this art form. As I was recording, not the last chapter, but the chapter before that, I was like, oh shit, Joseph. I don't have an illustration of Joseph, and I don't even have a chapter to put that illustration of him in. So I just threw him into the afterword. This particular illustration I took from the end of chapter illustrations from part 3. He looks wonderfully handsome, as he always does. And yeah, I think I've dragged this out too long. I don't really want to say goodbye because Over Heaven has been such a big project to me. I just want to keep talking about it and talking about it. I guess I can just in other videos, but it says I've been recording for 1 hour and 21, and I think you guys will be more than happy to make me stop. So, yes, it's time for an ending. I will continue this tomorrow. Before I go out tonight and have my head exploded by some Japanese teenage punk. Stay mortal, don't be jump scared by death, and I, as the Germans say, ich hole mich Himmel.